Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you again. Just want to say that whatever's happening at the moment with regard to government regulations, we are allowed to celebrate Mass in public again, and we will be starting this weekend. So there will be weekend Masses here on Saturday at 12 o'clock, which will be the Mass that's recorded for YouTube. Then there'll be Mass in Market Bosworth at 5 o'clock, Mass here at 6:30 on Saturday, 8 o'clock and 9:45 on Sunday. We sent off to get permission for Earl Shulton, so hopefully within the next 2 weeks we'll be able to do that as well. And if there are not many people here, then obviously we're going to cut down the number of Masses. For saying 7 Masses in a weekend for me is a lot, really, but we'll just see. But I hope you'll feel that you can come and that all the requirements of keeping COVID-19 at bay have been observed. And in a way, you're not supposed to notice. It's meant to happen in a relaxed manner without people feeling put off or unwelcome. And so I sent you that letter last week. I'm not going to go over that. You read that carefully, and let's look forward to seeing each other once again, and really looking forward to it myself. Today I'm sort of thinking out loud, really, as much as anything. Just turning a few things over in my mind with you listening and watching. I remember 50 years ago, I can remember that far back, yesterday is what I struggle with. When I was a student, we did 2 years of philosophy. And putting it bluntly, it was just plain boring. And we did Platonic philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, existentialist philosophy, empiricist philosophy. And the guys that were teaching us were very eccentric. I don't know whether that had anything to do with the subject or whatever. The priest that was teaching us philosophy in our first year, he'd got a stutter, which sort of made it even more difficult. And the guy that did the second year, he'd just got a nervous twitch like this. And so he was teaching us 2 wonderful subjects, which I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear about. One is called epistemology, and the other is called metaphysics. So epistemology is, how do I know that I know? And metaphysics is, how do I know that I am? And I'm not sure whether these things are necessary for salvation, but your man with the twitch, he was a Dublin man, and he'd sort of go, how do I know I'm not a table? I thought, well, if you don't know, mate, who does? And it was very strange. And then they gave us these books to read, right? It was amazing. There was one book, and I'm not joking you, it was that thick, by a German philosopher called Martin Heidegger. And it was called Being and Time. And it was so boring. And it was even better at putting you to sleep than one of my homilies. So you start the first page and you'd be halfway down the page and you'd be gone. So I never got through this book at all. And there was an equally thick book by a Canadian Jesuit called Bernard Lonergan called Insight. And again, it was very big and very dull and boring. And so you kind of use them to prop the bed up, really, more than anything. But I had to read some of this stuff, and I'm not so sure, as I say, it was necessary for salvation. However, Insight, not Bernard Lonergan's long book, but some of his notions. Insight is one of the most important gifts that we can have, especially for a believer. And it is the ability to see the truth of a situation or what that situation means or what it might lead to. And that is a huge gift to have, especially during this time of COVID-19. Even prophetic, we'd say, to read the signs of the times, to see what does all this mean. Of course, there will be those with their own political agenda who will tell us what it means for their own good purposes, but most of that is not actually true. But to see what things mean and what they might lead to is very important. It applies, for example, to issues like climate change. What are we doing to the planet? Like racism, where is that leading? Where does it come from? To do with our blindness to things that we prefer not to think about, like selling weapons to the Saudis and claiming to be a peaceful nation, and lots of things. And insight also provides us into a vision of the life of God. When you read the scriptures, for example, you read a gospel that you might have read lots of times, and all of a sudden you get an insight as to what it means. And for me personally, some years ago, I remember now, the classic example of that was the story of the prodigal son. And I've said this to you before, I know, but there you are, a story about two sons. One was rather boring but did everything right. The other was rather interesting and did everything wrong. And he came back to his dad and he wasn't sorry, and that was the point. But he got a big fuss made of him, and the other son couldn't understand. And it was some years before it dawned on me what this parable was about, because it was one little sentence in the middle, almost hidden away. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him. He was a long way off. A long way off physically and a long way off mentally. But the father, representing God, went out to him, clasped him and embraced him joyfully. And that's what God's love is about. So you get an insight. And I remember Pope Francis, he gave a little talk about the marriage at Cana. And again, it was something that I'd never really thought about until Pope Francis said that, about the 6 stone water jars. We're told there were 6 water jars there meant for the ablutions of the people. In other words, they were full of dirty water, and they topped them up to the brim, but it was actually dirty water. So Jesus turned dirty water, the water of people's dirtiness, if you like, into wine. And the Pope spoke about, how he changed sinful people into splendid people, washed away the dirt and turned it into something delightful. And I'd never thought about that. So you find, don't you, as you go along, when you read these things, all of a sudden something comes to you that you did not notice before. And that's what we call insight. And it's sort of something that comes from the Lord. And then we try to discover, well, what is he saying to us? What is the Lord saying to me? You sit and say your prayers and expect an answer, but you might be driving the car or sitting in the bath or something, or early in the morning in bed, waking up, and some thought will come into your mind, or something you'd not thought about. The number of times, for example, I've gone out in my car to visit somebody, and going along the road, I thought, I'll just nip in and see someone while I'm here. And you go and you find, thank God you've come, Father. It's just it's the right person today. And that wasn't something that came from me. It was just something that the Lord puts into you almost when you're not expecting it. And that happens to us often. But much of this comes down to what we call the human psyche, which is where the philosophy and psychology comes in again. How does the human psyche work, and what happens? The psyche is that part of the person that determines our behaviour, basically. In Christian thinking, we often refer to it as our soul, not as some sort of nebulous thing that flows off, but the core of our being, our mind, our emotions, our convictions, and so on. And when we examine that part of our life, our psyche, we find certain anomalies, that the psyche seems to work in a strange way. And we find often detachment from what is real or denial of what is real. That the psyche somehow can do this to us. So the best example of that was there was a program on television quite some years ago now, and it was a drama documentary set in a very elegant and schloss, big German chateau in the middle of Bavaria. And it showed all these German generals sitting there, drinking brandy, smoking cigars, looking at these architectural drawings and talking about throughput and end product and all of that. And the architectural drawings were the drawings of the crematoria for Auschwitz and the other places. So in this extremely civilized manner, nice meal, everything else, they were actually planning the extermination of 6 million Jewish people and various others as well. But it was all done in a very civilized way. And you say to yourself, how can the psyche somehow excuse such dreadful behavior and even make it civilized? And that's because often evil is rather banal. It's not always aggressive. It's actually quite banal and even unnoticeable. But the psyche, in some people, doesn't make that distinction. It can detach reality from how we think and do things. Another thing, a suicide bomber. How can a person think that what they are doing in destroying themselves and lots of other people is for the glory of God? One of the most incredible things I ever saw many, many years ago was a beautiful prayer written by a man offering his life to God. God, I am in your hands. I offer you my life and all that it's been and all that it might be. It was a beautiful prayer. I'd be proud if I'd said that prayer myself. A prayer of faith, a prayer of love. And it was the prayer of a man called Mohammed Atta. And he was one of the 2 pilots who flew the planes into the Trade Center in New York on 9/11. So how could he have this beautiful prayer about surrendering his life to God when he was in the process of destroying himself and 3,000 other people as well? It's strange. And when we talked about climate destruction, God has put his hand on Greta Thunberg. I'm going to talk to you about her another time. And as he often does for people to prophesy, to speak the signs of the times, this wonderful passage at the beginning of the prophet Jeremiah, our Lord, I do not know how to speak, I am a child. Do not say I am a child. I am with you to sustain you and guide you. And this child, this young person, has given us her insight into what's going to happen if we carry on the way we do, wasting things, using the wrong power sources, and generally destroying our planet. But we've detached ourselves from that so we can maintain our lifestyle. More sinister is abuse, the abuse of children. And to this day, I have to say to you, as a priest, it is this, what you know, it's the saddest thing in my life. That is why I do not wear clerical garb, because I am ashamed of my brothers. And I cannot understand how somebody can feel that this behaviour is appropriate. What has happened to their psyche to think that that sort of relationship with an innocent child or person is appropriate or desirable. One talks about pathological conditions, and indeed that's true. And of course, there's sociopaths, psychopaths everywhere who seem to detach themselves in their psyche from reality and then do the most dreadful things. All these stabbings that have taken place, for example, people just going out and stabbing people, almost at random, but somehow this pathological situation in the mind has detached itself from reality, and that is the classic, that is in child abuse. And the ultimate child abuse, of course, which is as civilized as the final solution, is the abortion of unborn children. It's all very civilized, isn't it? Talk about a procedure and terminating the pregnancy. But we're actually killing babies. Killing babies. And now there is an attempt to allow a child who has been tested for having Down syndrome to be aborted right up to birth. So one day before this child is due to be born, a fully formed person can be murdered. One day after its infanticide. For some parents who lost a child at 20 weeks, they're offered a funeral, bereavement service, and so on. Another parent who's lost a child at 20 weeks shoves it in the bin because it's been aborted. How can those things be present in the psyche? How can that happen? And some people now, they're so detached from reality, is that they've had an abortion, they give the child a name, and they give the child a funeral, and they go to the grave. And you think, you have done this. You have done this to your son or daughter, whom you have named and given a funeral to, but you've done it. And so that there is this detachment and denial of what is real. And we don't have the insight to see that. We are being told at the moment about Black Lives Mattering. Of course they do. People are bending the knee, they're having demonstrations. All the politicians are talking about Black Lives Matter, this is it. Black Lives Matter unless you are a black refugee, which case you don't matter and we want to get rid of you. Well, where is the anomaly there? We say Black Lives Matter, we demonstrate and so on, but if the refugee's trying to get here because someone's trying to kill them elsewhere and they happen to be black, then they don't matter. So there is this, if you like, anomaly is the best word for it, that takes place in the human psyche that somehow enables us or excuses us from doing what we should do and might do. And it also applies in the life of faith. For many years, my concern has been that lots of people claim to be Christians and Catholics, but actually don't act like it. And they can come along and bring their baby for baptism. They can promise to bring this child up within the community and then disappear. They can have their child prepared for First Communion and it's their last communion. But somehow in their psyche they've said, well, this is all right, because that psyche is impaired. Or they can be in a church praising God and doing all of that, but actually not care about anybody else. Not care about people they should be looking after and being good to, both here and abroad, even their own family. somehow we can make that detachment and denial. And because we've done that, our believing is therefore inauthentic. It's not real faith, because real faith expresses itself, and it expresses itself in behavior which is molded by the Lord to be instinctive. So it is our instinctive desire to go and support someone like Father Terry at the moment, who's really quite poorly, and people who should be thinking about him have said, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I just, what's happened to them? What has detached from reality, where a man who's looked after us for 42 years could be abandoned, and everybody thinks, oh, someone else can do it, but not me. It's the thought. These aren't easy things to say, but if there's to be a future for this church at all, we need insight. We need insight into what is happening to us, insight into what that might lead to, and insight into the life of Almighty God who is guiding us. And with the insight comes the willingness to be led and guided, sometimes in a place that we didn't think we would be guided to. So I'm just thinking aloud, if you don't mind, about all these things that trouble me and make me fearful for our future as a society, a civilization, and a church. We can't carry on detaching ourselves from reality or denying things. That's what leads to fake news, and we know all about that, don't we? The gospel is good news, not fake news. The gospel is the truth of our situation, not a set of alternative facts. And the life with the Lord is a real life of love and grace and mercy and forgiveness and generosity and compassion, not just words or mere talk.